So I am by trade mostly a fiction writer. I do a little bit of television and I've done a little bit of film. And language in a particular way every day. But then I've also had this weird other career as a programmer. And I should say I'm a semi-pro programmer in that I don't have any formal computer science training, but people pay me to build software, and which I've done, and I hope they'll pay me again. And so there, I work with another kind of language altogether, right? And one of the things that I've noticed about all our conversations here is that part of our, as the last speaker very eloquently put it, our fantasizing, our myth making, is about the completeness and utter functionality of these imaginings of these things which are coming and which are to come, right? And as a programmer, as somebody who actually writes the code that would run these things, I look at them and I see disasters waiting to happen, right? Because this little supercomputer that we all carry in our pockets, this is full of thousands of bugs. There's no piece of software on earth that doesn't have bugs in it, right? And so I'm building what I would call right now with a global team of 26 programmers, a piece of software that is, I think, moderately complex, but we hope is groundbreaking. And every day, I face the problem of ambiguity of language. And I don't mean ambiguity of language in relation to these other people, although we are speaking across native languages. One of them is in Bulgaria. The other guy is actually a Bulgarian who speaks English. But I mean ambiguity in terms of telling the compiler what to do, right? We're using syntactic constructions telling a machine what to do. And every time that we say something that has the potential for ambiguity, it blows up in our faces, right? When I sit down and program 16 times a day, I get this message, an exception has occurred, right? And it's always in red, and it's shocking, right? And so I also like the fact that it calls it an exception, right? The compiler calls it an exception, that you're telling me to do something that I did not accept, right? Expect. So these bugs are sort of written into the lives of programmers, and they occur through language. And every programmer has in his or her head a list of really destructive bugs, right? Which happen because of ambiguity. There's the famous Ariane 5 rocket, the French rocket that was going up, and 45 seconds after it took off, it blew up because of ambiguity in the representation of numbers from one kind of unit representation to another kind of unit representation. The most horrifying one was something called the Terac 5, which was an X-ray machine that, because of a thing called a counter overflow, which tragically coincided with operator error, it gave people 100 times the levels of radiation that it was supposed to give, and it killed 5 people in agonizingly painful ways and caused injury to a whole bunch of others, right? So what the programmer dreams about when you think about language is a completely denotative, unambiguous language. If I could just tell this damn machine exactly what to do, and if it would understand me and do exactly that, I would be a happy person. And the machine would be happy and would not throw exceptions at me, right? So there's been, I think, again, I really appreciated this because sort of long look back through the mythologies of history. There's always been this fantasy, I think, throughout human history of a completely unambiguous language. A language where meaning and syntax are tied together so tightly that you can actually understand other people and you can speak to other people in a way that actually makes sense. So I'm going to take you back even further than her. I'm going to take you back 4,000 years, right? To the beginnings of what one might call algorithmic language making. Right? So I'm sure you've all heard of the Vedas. There's the very early Hindu texts that are at the center of the Indic traditions. The earliest of which, the Rig Veda, by current scholarly opinion, somewhere between 2000 and 1500 BCE. So the Vedas are interesting in terms of the nature of what one might call the religiosity. They are believed to be unauthored texts, right? That is to say, that it is not God that is speaking to us through this text, some sort of deity. This is just the code that runs the universe, literally, right? And it's always present as a kind of background hum, right? Like a kind of cosmic hum. And there's a sense of timelessness. Universes are destroyed, universes are born, and each universe has this code that runs it. And in each universe, there are people, rishis, wise men and women, spiritually advanced, who are able to hear this cosmic hum, and then they translate it for us and put it in speech, in intelligible speech, right? And so there's a weird sort of theological angle in this. If you're an Orthodox Mimamsika, a person who actually really hews to the word of the Veda, you're by definition an atheist, right? Because you cannot believe in a deity because the code is what counts. Right? So it became then a sacrificial religion in which, in the sacrifice, the running of the universe, right, through the sacrifice, and people expended huge amounts of social energy and value and money. Kings built enormous altars stretching 78 feet from end to end, in which you perform these fire sacrifices. And this text is describing one of these grand sacrifices, which is still done till today. But notice that it says that all this was performed in and by speech, and what was speech made and speech gathered, and consisted only of speech. Right? So in the Indian cosmology, it's language all the way down. Right? At the bottom, there is nothing but language. Om. Right? That is the sound of creation. That is the sound of existence. That is the sound of dissolution. Right? So when you're reciting the Veda during the sacrifice, it's very important to get it right. And by get it right, it's not just the syntax, right? Not just the words, it's the rhythm, it's the sound, it's the pronunciation. And because you're running the code of the universe in this modeled way, if you make even a tiny mistake in the pronunciation, it will backfire and it will destroy you, right? So there was a huge amount of energy, of cultural energy, intellectual energy poured into the understanding of the Veda and into the transmission of the Veda from generation to generation without change, right? And this was developed into what are called the Vedanga, the limbs of the Veda, right? These auxiliary disciplines. And it has largely succeeded, or absolutely succeeded. As far as we know, the Vedas that are recited today by Pandits are exactly the same as were recited 4,000 years back. There's archaic tones in there which are no longer used in any other kind of modern Indian language, or even Sanskrit. Notice that 4 of these auxiliary disciplines are devoted to language, right? Which again betokens the importance of language in this understanding of the cosmos. So we have phonetics, meter, grammar, etymology. Oh, I should mention in passing, kalpa, ritual, is where the beginnings of Indian mathematics comes about, right? Because there you're building altars to very specific ratios and proportions, so you have to understand how to make triangles, you have to understand directions, you have to understand all of that. But it's out of the discipline of grammar that in 500 BCE comes an incredible revolution, which is a grammar. But it is the world's first generative grammar. And when I say that, and especially if I say this in the Indian, heavily politicized Indian context, I can sound like a crazy nationalist, right? And sort of having this post-colonial fantasy about the past, about the glorious past. So I want to show you how this thing actually works, right? So you get a sense of what it's actually doing. So it's a text called the 8 Ashtadhyayi, written by a man named Parnini, about whom we know very little. The main body of the Ashtadhyayi is a 3,976 rule set. Right? It's just rules, and I'll show you how the rules work. And it has these auxiliary texts, which are smaller, that go along with it. These is just a list of the phonemes of the Sanskrit language. Although I should caution you and tell you that at this time, it wasn't actually called Sanskrit. It was just known as Bhasha, the language, or Devavani, the language of the gods. Right? And I'll tell you why then it comes to be called Sanskrit. So it's a list of the phonemes of the language. But there's something, it looks really simple. It's 14 lines, but there's very clever stuff going on in here. The red letters at the end are actually not part of the phonemes. Those are meta markers. Right? And the way they work is that in the body of the rules, Panini will use, for instance, ach. And what you do when you hear in the rules ach is that you start with the first letter A, right? And then you start going down the list until you reach the marker ch, right? C down there in the fourth row. You discard all the markers that you've collected, and you're left with just a list, an ordered list. Right? A, I, U, Ri, Ri, E, O, E, O. Anybody get what those are? Yeah, they're all the vowels. Right. So you can also do this. Hal, you start with ha in the fifth row, and you go down all the way to the bottom as the marker, you discard la, and you get all the consonants. Right? And then you get tash, which are the voice consonants. There's a sort of system of classifying each of these phonemes depending on which part of the mouth and how they are produced. Right? And the way that they are used, I should say that the Panini uses 42 of these abbreviations. They're called pratyaharas. But there are many hundred others which are also possible, of course, during in this list. So the way they're used in this list, this is a rule from the 6th chapter, which says ik is replaced by yarn if ach follows. Right. So ach we already know is all the vowels. So what he's really saying is the phonemes represented by ik should be replaced by the phonemes represented by yarn if a vowel follows. And so what that translates into is an ordered replacement. Right? So it makes for a great deal of abbreviation. Right? You can state very complex things through the use of these ordered lists in the text. So it's a tiny little text, Shiva Sutra. It seems so miraculous to Panini's contemporaries and everyone who followed that they called it the Shiva Sutra because it was believed that Shiva, the god himself, revealed this text to him. There's been some interesting modern scholarship done on this, but it's mathematically optimal. And Paul Kiparsky, who's a linguist at Stanford, argues that for the purposes that Panini uses, as we'll see, it is linguistically optimized. Right? That this is the most optimal way that you could have of making a list like this. The next auxiliary text is a list of verbal roots. These are about 2,000 that are stated in the present tense. He starts, of course, with be, who, which is to say to be, right? Which makes sense. The first, so the most basic thing is being. We get from bhumi, right? The earth on which we all exist, and so forth. And you see who again. Kri, the second one, to do, make, and perform, is the verbal root that then you can, through a series of transformation, you make into things like karta, doer, or karma, action, right? And karma, you all know, right? In both its ordinary sense and its metaphysical sense. So there's about 2,000 of these verbal roots. And then there's a list of nominal stems from which you can make nouns. And while the verbal roots are considered to be a complete list, this is the open-ended part of the system. Each nominal root represents a class of nouns, and later people have added other nouns and other stems in here. Right? So this becomes the place where addition and modifications can be done. All right, so before I get to the rule set, I want to show you some more brilliant cleverness. Right? So if you read those sentences, give Chaitra a cow, a blanket to Maitra, and also to Gopal, what you're doing is you're borrowing semantics in the lower sentences from the upper ones. Right? You can elide when you say also to Gopal what you've already said in the first sentence and in the second sentence. Panini does in his rules that there are certain header rules, and everything that falls below those rules can then start borrowing from the rules immediately above it in the list. And this is the most famous example of this kind of rule. It's very short. It's 3.3 in the 3rd chapter, the 3rd section, Rule 65. It and stretch it out. It borrows from 11 other sutras above it, and it becomes huge. Right? And it says something very peculiar and complicated about flutes and so forth. Right? So what he's able to do through these various techniques is achieve a great deal of compression by text. So the number of sutras, like I said, are 3,976 rules. Number of words with compounding. Sanskrit is a language like German where you can compound words together. Is 7,007. If you take them apart, they become 9,843 words. But then if you take all of this rule borrowing and you expand each rule out into its complete form, you actually get 40,000 words. Right? So he achieves about a 1:6 compression ratio by employing all these clever little techniques of abbreviating and shortening and using these ordered lists. So finally to the rules, right? There's various kinds of rules. There are definitions, of course, right? Where he defines parts of speech, kinds of rules, what a verb is, what a noun is. There are meta rules, which tells you how other rules should behave. There are headings, like I said, right? So especially at the beginnings of chapters, there are heading rules from which lower rules that affect the functioning of lower rules. There are some rules that work according to context. There are other rules that work according context-free. Is possible, right? So one rule can set off another rule, which can then in turn call the first rule again. Right? And so the form of the rules in general is like this. When you see an element E, which has immediately to the left of it a left context, and perhaps to the right of it a right context, in that case, then replace E with X, whatever X might be. Right. So let me show you how one of these things works. Remember bhu, the first verb root, which refers to the state of existence, of being in its most simplest form. What do you want to do? What happens when you want to convert this into a noun, which refers to the internal state of being? I don't know if there's any Hindi speakers or modern Indian language speakers here. The word is bhava. Right. So the way bhu becomes bhava is that through an application of one rule, what you get is a phoneme added onto bhu, which becomes bhugna. Right? And this is actually external to the rule set. You have to know how these rules get applied. One rule sets off another, which sets off another. And what you do is, it's a very defined working rule order. Each rule applies some sort of transformation of the string that has been passed to it, and exudes another string, right? So any modern programmer would recognize these as string functions, right? You're putting a string into a machine, and you're getting another string out of the end, and then finally at the end you end up with bhav, which is the state of being, internal state of being, right? According to the strict grammarian terminology, this is not yet a word, but because it has not yet been put into a sentence. Because once it's put into a sentence, Sanskrit is a highly inflected language, and it will acquire masculine, feminine suffixes that will indicate masculinity or femininity, singularity, duality, or multiplicity. And then it will become a word. But there are other rules in this rule set that actually operate and allow you then to generate those various forms of the root here bhav into whatever you need within a particular sentence. Right? So what the grammar actually is, it's an algorithm. It's a machine. It eats phonemes, to use the word that we just used, and morphemes and words, and at the other end it produces language. And it produces an infinity of grammatically correct Sanskrit words and sentences. And in fact, that's one of the problems of studying Sanskrit, is that there are an infinite amount of words that are possible, however, we don't know if they were actually used. Right? So it makes it both, in a sense, formally very precise, but also produces an infinity of language. And as soon as this happens, people recognize that something radical has been done. And that's when it starts to get called Sanskrit. And Sanskrit is actually not a proper noun in the sort of Western sense. It is actually a technical term. It is actually stating that this is a language that has been perfected, that this is a formal language. Right? So as time goes on, acquires a sort of patina of perfection, of sophistication. It's a formal language that then is spoken and taught. It's down to Pali, right? So there's an Indologist who calls this the Sanskrit cosmopolis, across a whole host of cultures and other languages, it works as a lingua franca. Right? If you want to do science, if you want to do business, Sanskrit is what you learn and speak. People have found it as far away as Egypt, and then on the other end in Bali. Right? So across this certain swath of the world, this is, I guess, a kind of equivalent in many ways to Latin. So the Ashtadhyayi itself has an interesting career in colonial times. So the first Orientalist researchers discover this and take it to the West, right? Oh, and I should have said also that in terms of its compression, it's a very small text, right? You can print the entire 3,976 rule set out in about 40 pages of about 20 text, right? And so it appeared to them, once they were given this by the Sanskrit pundits, to be this sort of magical object. So the first guy who presented it at the Royal Society in London called it the blackest of oracles. Okay? But the Germans then took the lead in translating this and trying to understand it. Emphasizing about. And then once the Germans actually got this translation and the understanding predicated, it enters the 19th century revolution of science that goes on and becomes the basis of much of modern linguistics. Right? So that Mr. Mustache there on the top right, that of course is our friend Ferdinand de Saussure. I'm sure you all have heard of him. I'm not sure how many of you know that he was a Sanskrit professor. And that his theory of the sign looks suspiciously like something called Sphora, which was elaborated by a Sanskrit grammarian named Bhartrihari in the 5th century. Over on the right, we have Leonard Bloomfield, who's sometimes called the father of American linguistics. He was also a Sanskrit professor, and in 1939, he published a book called Menominee Morphophonemics, in which he uses explicitly Paninian methods to describe a Native American language. The person on the bottom right there is Roman Jakobson, who creates phonology, again borrowing heavily from Panini until well into the early modern and past it. The notion that the West had of the basic unit of language was the word, right? So the idea of the morpheme and the phoneme comes from Panini into the world of linguistics. And then on the bottom right, there is, of course, our friend Noam Chomsky, right? And so from Chomsky, from Bloomfield's paper, you have his student Zelig, and then Zelig in turn gets Chomsky, and then we get transformational generative linguistics of the 20th century, right? Although Chomsky, who has quite an ego, likes to disclaim all influence. He won't even acknowledge Zelig or Bloomfield, right? Like he wants to say that he went up the mountain to steal linguistic fire from the gods himself. Right? As an act of genius, right? It's a very romantic idea. So, I mean, sometimes, during my darker moments when I have my personal chip firmly on my shoulder, I often think about the way that this has influenced our world in that when in the 1950s, programmers working on early computers get tired of writing code in zeros and ones in binary code, and they start trying to create actual higher level languages. And there's a man called John Backus who works at IBM. He heads a formidable team of people, and they're trying to create formal languages, and they have to be formal because computers are dumb. So if you're going to use a language to talk to a machine, it has to adhere to very, very tight rules, right, in order to be able to be parsed by the computer. If they look towards linguistics and they see the work that Chomsky and others have done, right, and therefore then we get Fortran and we get COBOL, all the early, long ago, it feels like dinosaur times now in terms of computer language thinking, right? So what I'm saying is that all our lives, our robots are powered by this, but it feels to me sometimes like, again, this is one of those instances where work done by people elsewhere has been possessed, and that memory has been completely wiped out. I'm willing to bet that 90% of you are hearing about Panini for the first time today, right? So anyway, that's all my bitterness about this. All right, so what's also interesting about Panini's grammar is that as an algorithm itself, it's an interestingly and intriguingly powerful one, right? So when you think about the description of general computation, you generally think of the Turing machine, right, which is a mathematical and logical beast incarnated after Turing imagines it in a sort of abstract way. It gets incarnated in mechanisms, and you can now actually see an actual working Turing machine, more or less. But that's not the only way of describing general computation, right? So as I'm sure some of you know, Alonzo Church comes up with something called the lambda calculus, which depends on function application and substitution to also generalize, to describe general computation. And it is exactly an equivalent in power to a Turing machine, right? And then there's the third and lesser known of these rediscoveries of general computation, or the description of general computation in Emil Post, right? Who actually, earlier than either of these two people, through a system of string rewriting, describes general computation, right? And so what John Kirvani is arguing here is that what Emil Post is doing is, in a sense, rediscovering what Panini had done in 500 BC, right? And Panini would not have imagined or created a Turing machine, but his abstraction, this meta language that he creates, is equivalent in power so that it could describe general computation, right? Because it has recursion, it has ordered rule sets, it has rules that set off other rules, and so forth. The other interesting thing about Panini's grammar is, as Paul Kiparsky points out here, is that it is incredibly powerful in terms of taking language and being able to parse it. One of the problems with Chomsky's grammars is, or the descending grammars, or any grammars that exist for any other kind of language, generative grammars, is that they're unable to accurately parse sentences. So if I said to a robot, right, Mary ate a salad with spinach from California for lunch on Tuesday, right? It's a seemingly simple sentence. But when the computer tries to analyze it and build what is called a parse tree out of it, it ends up with 42 different parse trees because it doesn't know whether to attach with spinach to Mary ate or to her salad and so forth. Right? Your medical robot, if it asked your patient, who were you speaking to on the phone, and the patient said, New York University Martin Luther King Junior Scholarship Program Projects Coordinator, Susan Reed.
Right.
Right? If it said that, the poor robot would end up with 429 parse trees. Right? So what Panini's grammar, amazingly enough, is able to do is that for any grammatically correct Sanskrit sentence, it produces one parse. Right? And there's ways to engineer ambiguity even in Sanskrit, as we'll see. But for the most part, it is much more powerful in its parsing because of the accuracy and the precision of the rule set and how the rule set functions. So within the Indian context, this grammar had an incredible effect intellectually, socially, morally, everywhere. Right? Something profound had happened, and everyone knew this. Right? And so that's a postage stamp issued in 2004 by the Indian government. It's curious that they actually show him working with a stylus on palm leaf, because it's not at all clear that Panini actually did this with writing. Right? So usually we associate orality with illiteracy. Here we have a fiercely erudite and literate culture, right, that insists on the oral, and until about 300 BCE continues to hold writing as a technology in some contempt. So one of the arguments that is made for all of this energy that has been put into compression in Panini's system is that it is because it is designed for memorization and oral recitation. Right? And indeed, traditionally, the way that you actually learned this, if you were going to become a pundit, and by pundit I mean a scholar who would understand how the grammar actually works, not just a user of the language. You would go to school when you were about 6 and start learning it, and you would first memorize it, and then 12 years later you would actually emerge actually understanding how this very complex mechanism works. Right? So again, memorization, orality, and orality in the sense, even after writing gets really widespread and starts to get used, there is still this insistence on the efficiency of the sutra as a way of imparting and producing knowledge, right? Because the idea of knowledge production within the Indian context becomes the Panini grammar, right? And the sutra, I'm sure you all have heard this book before, but what you might not know that it has a very specific definition in the Indian context. The sutra, a text from about 350 AD Pabla, is always unambiguous. It states one thing and it states it clearly, and it is the most economical use of language that you can have. And it says, anyone who knows sutras knows this, right? So everyone tends to go towards this. And then also in terms of doing descriptive science, right? If you're trying to describe the way that a system works, what you want to do is to produce a grammar like Panini's for whatever system that it is that you're trying to describe. In other words, you describe its component parts, its phonemes and morphemes. You describe the set of rules which works on those elemental parts. And then once you've done that and you've produced a grammar, then you've actually done a successful job of modeling or describing the system. And so the consequence is that there's a 19th century French Indologist who said, I think correctly, if you want to understand Indian thought, the first thing you have to do is just start thinking like a grammarian. And then our friend Bhartrihari here, who's the 5th century grammar guy, the door to liberation. Right? What he's getting at is that if you can understand the grammar of the system, then you can start understanding how to actually work within the system and also escape it. Right? And specifically here, he's metaphysically referring to the grammar of birth, rebirth, suffering, life, death. Right? So if you can make sense of that, then you can then transcend it. I guess my larger point here is that we have a very, very efficient natural language, which actually, weirdly enough, then through Parnini's intervention gets formalized and becomes, in some sense, a formal language. It becomes an extraordinarily stable language. One of the problems with working with Sanskrit manuscripts is that you can't actually tell sometimes just by looking at the language which century it was written in. So you can look at something from 700 BCE and you can look at something from 300 AD and not be able to tell the difference because the formality of the language keeps it flexible yet stable. Right? If you ask a Sanskrit Pandit today, not me, I read Sanskrit as like a second or third grade level, which is what my tutor tells me. But if you had a really good Sanskrit Pandit write a Sanskrit letter and you time machined it back 2,000 years, they'd be able to read it. Right? But what they soon discover, the people working within this intellectual world, is that you might have nailed down syntax, but semantics is very slippery. Semantics keeps getting away from you. The meaning keeps getting away. And so then famously, this 11th century aesthetic philosopher named Mamet, a critic, points out that you have the sentence, the sun has set. Very simple, right? The denotative meaning of this should be absolutely clear. The sun has set, the sun has set. What else could be going on here? But then he says, when said by the general to the king, it can mean now is the opportunity to attack the enemy. When said by the confidant to the girl in love, it can mean you should set forth to meet your lover. And he goes through a bunch of other examples, and he comes to number 10, and he says, when it's said by an impatient girl waiting for her beloved's return from a journey, it can mean my love has not come even today. Right? And so then he finally concludes that the denoted or directly expressed meaning of the words the sun has set never varies, while its suggested meaning varies with the variation in accessory conditions, such as the context, the character of the speaker, etc., etc. Thus, in fact, there is no end to this number of suggestions. Right. So this is very frustrating to a certain kind of person, right? And particularly to the people who work in logic, right? Because how can you have a good logical philosophical argument if you can't even agree what the hell you mean, right? So what these guys do over the space of about 2,000 and 1,800 years, especially with the new reason from 1200 CE onwards, a special new low-level Sanskrit, Shastric Sanskrit they call it, which is logical or scientific Sanskrit, in which Chaitra goes to the village becomes there is an activity which leads to a connection activity, which has agent no one other than Chaitra, specified by singularity, etc., etc., etc. Right. And then our sentence, if I extend it a bit, the sun has set over the horizon. What you would do with it is to construct something like a parse tree. You do an analysis of the sentence. You figure out what the verb is. You figure out what the action is. The agent is, I'm sorry. You figure out what the location is. And then in Shastric Sanskrit, you would say there is an activity which leads to a connection activity, which has an agent no other than the sun, specified by singularity, because you could have several suns if you're not too slippery, has taken place in the past, etc., etc. And they actually wrote books like this, and it actually worked, right? Because it does. Those of you who are computer geeks might recognize a kind of vague familial resemblance if you work with the semantic web with the web ontology language, OWL, right? Where it's based on first-order logic, where you set out triples in exactly this kind of way, so that you can actually make machine-readable meaning happen, right? So that the computer on the other side of the world can figure out what your website is actually trying to talk about. But meanwhile, on the other side, there's a bunch of other kind of people, right? And they are asking the question, within this very sort of sophisticated linguistic intellectual universe, why is poetry beautiful? What is it about poetry, some kinds of language, that strike us as beautiful and make it possible emotionally poetry? Answers, as one might expect in a universe where there is so much concentration on the structure of language, the earliest answers all formless. Right? So some people argue that, look, what makes language beautiful is figures of speech. I mean, that's a sensible thing to say. Right? If I look at Shakespeare, those beautiful figures of speech, metaphors, the punning, makes an emotional connection for me. Other people said, well, no, I guess I don't know what their equivalent would be, but look at Hemingway or look at Annie Dillard, right? Like you don't have figuration there going on at the same rate. It's very simple language, but it's still beautiful. So then the other people answered style, right? And style defined by the clarity of the language, by the heaviness of the words that is used, by the actual diction that's in there. Style and qualities, then, they're making this sort of anatomical metaphor. They said style and qualities are the body of poetry, right? And figures of speech are like the ornaments, right? And then aesthetics that itself became the study of ornamentation. Right? And this survived for many, many centuries until in the 9th century, this guy named Anand Vardhana comes along and writes a book called The Light of Suggestion. So until Anand Vardhana, everyone in this, especially the linguists, agreed that the way that meaning was conveyed by language was through two semantic functions. One was denotative meaning, and the other was metaphorical and figurative meaning, right? And the example that the Pandits always used was Gangayam Ghosha, a village in the Ganga. Literally a village in the Ganga. The English sort of equivalent would be a village on the Mississippi, right? And so what the Pandit said is that, look, what happens is that you understand the denotative meaning of this phrase, but then your mind works out too quickly for you to understand, of course, and it happens below the surface of your consciousness, that it cannot literally be a village in the Ganga, right? So then the figurative aspect of it comes into play, and we understand we're talking about a village next to the Ganga. Right? And what Anand Vardhana smartly points out is that he says poets use a third semantic function. That there is something here that you guys are not seeing, that you're not understanding. And what is that? It's suggestion. So he's very careful to say, look, I'm not inventing anything new here. About something that has been operating in all the poems that we all agreed all along are beautiful, that has been working, and I'm going to show you how it works. This idea of suggestion, right? And so this is one of his early examples. The speaker here is a woman to a wandering monk who is collecting alms, right, in the bowl. I'm sure you've all seen figures of this. And she says to him, "Go your rounds freely, gentle monk, the little dog is gone. Just today from the thickets by the Goda River came the fearsome lion and killed it." So what Anandvardhana says about this is like, think about what she's actually doing. Is she really concerned about the monk's welfare? Or about the little dog? No, she's trying to keep him away from the thickets by the river, where she has an assignation with a lover later down. Right? So you see how setting and context makes this possible. Right? And Anandvardhana's point about this is that none of this is in the denotative or figurative qualities of the actual words there. It's all in the suggestion. This is another very famous example that he uses. Again, the speaker is a woman, and this time she's saying, "Mother-in-law sleeps here, I there. Look, traveler, while it is light, for at night when you cannot see, you must not fall into my way." What is going on here? It's obvious, right? What she's saying is exactly, what she means is exactly the opposite of what she's saying. She's issuing an invitation and an instruction. Right? So both of these, the way that suggestion is working here is to suggest a situation, right? But suggestion can also evoke emotion, right? And here you need a little bit of context. Here, there's a famous sage who has come to Himavan, who's the king of the Himalayas, and is telling him that he should marry his very young daughter Parvati to God Shiva, because Parvati has been in love with Shiva since she was a girl, and she has performed huge austerities in order to win and to become suitable as the bride of Shiva. And standing with lowered face beside her father, right, as this 15, 16-year-old girl has immensely thought on marriage before, she counted the petals of the lotus. And what Anandvardhana says about this is that in that gesture of looking down, the reader sees shyness and therefore appreciates and is able to savor young love and therefore the rasa, the aestheticized sentiment of the erotic. So if you've ever taken a creative writing class, you've been given that famous direction, show, don't tell, right? So you can think of this as a kind of 9th century version of that, although these guys would have said, suggest, don't tell. And again, there is this feeling, the very sort of important thing here, that it's neither figurative nor it is denotative, right? Poetry speaks through its silences, through what it doesn't say. But there's an even more subtle way in which language can work to evoke feeling. Remember our example of the village in the Ganga. Now, when I say to you a village in the Ganga today, unbidden, I'm sure there might be some sort of cloud of images that emerges perhaps almost at the surface of your consciousness of, I don't know, crowds of pollution, right? Unfortunately. But back in their day, what Anandvardhana says about this, if somebody says Gangayam Kusha, there is a feeling of sanctity, right? Of coolness that is conveyed. And he says that all language works like this, right? There's never a clean transfer of meaning from one speaker to the listener. There is this cloud of suggestive meaning around itself. And therefore, the clever poet, by deploying this another semantic ability of language, is able to create a huge impact on the listener. So here's, you need context for this. This is a scene from the Ramayana. Here, the Prince Ram has been exiled to the forest away from his kingdom because of court intrigue. His beloved wife Sita, or Vaidehi, has been kidnapped by the wicked king Ravana, who's fallen in love with this beautiful woman. It's the season of the monsoon, which paradoxically, I guess, I don't know, it doesn't quite work to translate really well. In India, the monsoon is the season of love, right? Because the summers are terrible, and then suddenly it rains, and the dark clouds appear, and everything is cool, and your thoughts turn to, you know, hot tea and sexy songs or something, right? So this is Rama in the agony of the monsoons, missing his beloved Sita, right? And he says, winds carry the small rain, the peacocks, friends of the clouds, cry out with joy. Let all this be, my heart is hard. I am Rama and can bear it all. How will she live? Alas, my queen, alas, be brave. Now, Anandvardhana's question about this verse is, why should we have the word Rama in this sentence? The listener, the reader already knows that Rama is the speaker. There's no information being added here. What he answers is, in this verse, the suggestive word is Rama. By this word, we understand Rama is developed into various suggestive qualities, not simply as the possessor of the name. Or in other words, if you can imagine the great actor doing that line on stage, when he says, I am Brahma, I am hard-hearted. In that moment, the viewer then experiences all the tragedy, is reminded of all the tragedy that has already befallen this man. And because this is a well-known story, we know the inevitable tragedies that are going to follow. So through the expression, through the inclusion of that word Rama, we get this tiny little exploding moment of meaning that flowers out into many, many suggestive qualities of Rama. And 100 years later, after Anandvardhana, this guy called Abhinavagupta comes along, who writes a commentary on Anandvardhana's book, and he says, notice what he says, and since these suggestions are countless, they cannot be conveyed simultaneously by means of the denotative functions of words. Even if these innumerable suggestive properties were to be conveyed by denotation one by one, since they will not be had in one single act of cognition, they will not be the source of a wondrous aesthetic experience. So at this point, denotation fails to produce the effect that you're looking for. You have to do the suggestive semantic transfer. Does this make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Abhinavagupta himself is a hugely interesting man. He's one of these weird polymathic figures who appears once a century. He writes 51 books, out of which we have, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, 28. He's an aesthete, he's a philosopher, he's a poet himself. And he's very interested in the psychology of this experience, of rasa, of aesthetic pleasure. And what he argues is, no animal, no being, animal or deity, exists with which man has no affinity of nature. Right? And because this is the Indic universe, remember, reincarnation is in play here. The world is beginningless, and every man before that, which he actually is, has been all the other beings as well. The consciousness of the spectator thus possesses the latent impressions of all the possible beings, and he is therefore susceptible of identifying himself with each other. Right? So the idea here is that through life, right, even if you just consider this life, as we go along, we build up this store of memory traces, right, even though they might be forgotten. And what happens during the aesthetic experience is that we are able to then bring alive those memory traces again, except this time we don't attach our egos to them. I am suffering the loss of my beloved, right? Rama is experiencing the loss of his beloved, and yet you feel his pain. So here, what you have on the one hand is the purposeful ambiguity, the resonance, the endless resonance induced by the poet, but what is reacting to it is the endless ambiguity of the human being, right? Of all those layers of sediments of memory and consciousness that we each have within us. And in the Indic universe, it's also when you were a tortoise, right? And then you were gold, right? All of those memories are also somewhere contained within the memory store that you have. And so it's ambiguity speaking to ambiguity. He goes on, Abhinav Gupta, to make a couple of other intriguing statements. The relishing of beauty arises in us from our memory bank of mental states which are suitable to the representational science of that which is of what is being portrayed on the stage or what we're reading about. So what is born here is a gustation, a savoring that eclipses such worldly mental states as the joy that might be produced by reunion of old friends. Right? And again, here the reasoning is when you meet an old friend or you have some joy in your present life, your ego is attached to it. Right? It is causal. Right? Somebody says to you, it's not a production as results from the working of a cause. And by cause, he means here something in the real world that is actually working in some sort of substantiality in the present. And then he goes on to make some statements which are fairly radical in terms of the linguistic universe that he's working within. First of all, he discards meaning altogether. Right? Even alliteration of harsh and soft sounds can be suggestive of rasa, of aestheticized emotion, though they are no use to meaning. Here, then, there is not even the shadow of metaphor. Secondly, poetic sentences do not require validity so as to motivate hearers by communicating a true meaning. Right? So the Veda speaks the truth. In Shastra, in science, you have to speak the truth. In history, you have to make an attempt to tell the truth. But in poetry, it doesn't matter. Right? And you can break syntax, you can break grammar, you can break meaning, as long as it produces aesthetic effect. Because the savoring arises like a magical flower, having as its essence at that very moment, and not connected with earlier or later times. So all its use is in the present. There is no future and there is no past. And then what is the nature of rasa, of aestheticized joy? In itself, it exists through the suppression of our usual call of mental stupor and blindness as we encounter the aesthetic object. Further, it induces in us a state of fluidity, enlargement, and expansion. Right? So when you're watching Game of Thrones and watching something really horrible happen, you get effortless, one-pointed concentration. Pain, right? And as recent research has shown, the pain that you're feeling is the same neurons that react to actual pain. It's not like there's two different systems for fictional pain and real pain. The only thing is that you're not attaching yourself to that pain. And yet you experience it as a kind of joy. It is not a form of ordinary cognition, nor is it erroneous, nor ineffable, not like ordinary perception, nor does it consist of a superimposition. Right? It's not as if you're necessarily projecting your life on top of that. It differs from memory, inference, and any other form of ordinary self-consciousness. During the experience of rasa, what is enjoyed is consciousness itself. So that by engaging in the aesthetic encounter, we are able to experience these fluctuations in consciousness and actually take pleasure in this variation. Because we are distanced, because it's in a sense, what he calls it is transpersonalization. Does this remind you of anything? Where else do you experience a joy that is not like ordinary cognition?
This is a definition of art.
Right, but where else do you get this feeling?
Sex?
None of yeah, no. Sex plays a big role here. I don't have time to go into it. But Abhinav Gupta was a big tantric dude, an actual realized tantric master according to his contemporaries. So apparently, sex was a big part of all of this. But yeah, that's a big huge sidebar waiting for another conference.
Virtual space.
No, none of you are enlightened beings. Well, when you meditate, right? What does the teacher tell you? Feel the emotion. You can't get away from thought. Your monkey mind jumps around. You feel things, but don't attach yourself to them. Let it slip away. Right? So the enlightened being is somebody who is able to experience real life in the exact same sense that we experience theater. Right? It's not that the Buddha does not experience empathy or suffering with the other person, but the reason that the Buddha smiles is that the Buddha is able to distance himself or herself from an egotistic personal connection to that. Right? And so in this cosmology, especially in this Anandvardhana Abhinavagupta family tree, what they argue very specifically and very explicitly is that the aesthetic experience is the experience of enlightenment. They're not making a metaphor, they're not making a comparison. They are saying that what you get in the aesthetic experience is divinity. Right? So through an ambiguous encounter with ambiguity, you come into direct contact with the most truest part of yourself, right? The most authentic part of yourself. And you also expand, right? Imagination then enables us to become larger than ourselves. And so finally then he says, Anandvardhana, in a nice rhetorical mood. Remember those early guys said that style is the body of poetry, and figures of speech are like ornamentation. Anandvardhana comes back with, well, this endless vibration, this resonance, ambiguity is the soul. And it is the soul in the way that it's what makes poetry actually come alive within us. How are we doing time? So if I have a couple of minutes, I will show you.
Okay, take a couple.
Couple of minutes. Okay, really quick, because this is all old stuff that is in the book that Teresa was talking about, but I've been working on an essay about some other kinds of poetry within this universe that I'm just fascinated by, and that I think you might find interesting, because in a weird way, programmers, the other people who are obsessed with language, also do forms that kind of look like this. So Anandvardhana, at a certain point in this book, gets quite cocky about, right? So if you say money is the soul of poetry, right? Suggestion, resonance, this is what real poetry does. He recognizes that there are poems in the world in which resonance is not the primary thing, in which, let's say, figures of speech are more prominent. So he would describe that as kind of second-rate poetry. Right? But the worst poetry is the poetry in which there's absolutely no suggestion, and there is just poetic virtuosity. Right? And that is to him is third-rate poetry. Right? So he says, while Chitra might be much used in the efforts of beginners who are seeking practice, it is established from mature poets that Dhani alone is poetry, and like all modern poets, and he actually uses that word modern, should now be practicing this, now that I've shown you this stuff. Right? But I like third-rate things. I like looking at them, figuring out why people think of them as third-rate. So I just want to show you a couple of these. So here's a poem from the 7th century. It's an epic poem. And as usual in epic poems, people fight each other. So this is a battle scene. There's armies are moving. The warrior heroes are doing various things. There's intoxicated elephants. Right? Everyone is not thinking of pain. And it's fairly workmanlike verse. There's nothing like special in the sound or the rhythm of it. But if you look at it a bit more closely and you draw apart the syllables, you start to see certain patterns. And I'm not sure. You see? What if you draw a line like this, and a line like this, and a line like this? And then you read along that line. Sa, se, na, gamana, rande. And that's the first line of the poem. If you draw another line like this, and you read along that, it becomes ra, se, na, si, da, na, rata. Which is, of course, the second line of the poem. And then you do this, and you get the third line, and you do this, and you get the fourth line. Right? So the entire poem is kind of holographically contained within itself. And I don't see any sort of Indic faces here, but do you recognize a picture in there? So this is called a drum form, right? So what they did was, through this kind of syllabic arrangement, they made pictures inside the poems. Right? And so they did it swords, they did turtles, they did animals, they did lotuses, they did this. There's like thousands and thousands of variations of this, right? And so this is Chitrakavya, which Akarcharya, Bandacharya, which is like poetry that makes pictures or forms. And so according to Anand Vardhana's gradation, it's third rate, right? Because once you realize the wonder of this, there's nowhere else to go. There's no further depths to follow. Right? So this is the drum form. Here's another one from the 16th century. This is about Krishna. Krishna, who has been a young exile in the countryside, has come to the village, to the big town, a wrestling match, and the ladies are kind of enjoying his divinely hot body, right? He's all sweaty. And if we do our syllabic pulling apart operation on him, on this verse, and this time we draw a line like this and then read in this zigzag fashion, you get Samala Range. Look at the first syllables of the first line. Samala Range. Right? So if you read in that zigzag fashion, you get the entire first line. And then if you read that way, zigzagging in the opposite direction, you get the entire second line. So this is called a Gati Chitra because it suggests movement, and I don't think you'll be able to guess what kind of movement. But if you've ever been in a rural area and walked behind a cow, and she starts peeing, right? And you have this zigzag pattern. So they call this the cow urine.
This is for real? For real, this is the name?
Yeah. Go move it. Yeah. In India, cow urine has a different valence, right? Remember?
Yeah.
It's sacred. Yes, it's useful. I won't go into it. All right, finally, so I know I'm using up time. I just want to show you one more example from what is considered one of the masterful, absolute masterpieces of the form. This is from the 9th century again. The poem is called The Goddess's Century, or it could be called 100 Verses in Praise of the Goddess. And it's the poet is praising the goddess who gives benefits of various kinds and who are devoted to her. If we pull it apart, we see instantly that it's a Gomutrika, a cow urine form, right? It's the same thing. But there's something even more subtle going on here, in that if you take the first half of the first line and the second half of the first line, and you put them below each other, you can recover the entire first line by zigzagging back and forth in the two halves of the first line. So it's a double Gomutrika form, right? But once you start putting symmetries inside symmetries, you get a combinatorial explosion, right? Because now there are ways to recover that first line and the entire poem in many more ways than exists in a single Gomutrika, right? So what you get, as Daniel Ingalls points out, the total number of ways of reading this complete stanza is 256 to the fourth power, which is 4,260,312,864 ways, right? And so this becomes a Jalabandha, right? Because you can see it looks like a net. And the poet here has actually, as far as we know, invented this form. This is the first instance of the Jalabandha, right? Other people have done this after this, but he was the first one to do it. All right, so this is shloka number 84 out of the 100, and we're not at the end of the Chamatkara of the wonder. If you take the last 20 stanzas of this poem, and you take the first lines of stanzas 80 through 96, and you arrange them like spokes on a wheel, and then you take the remaining 4 stanzas and you start writing them around the wheel, you soon discover that every 4th syllable has already been written as part of the spoke of the wheel. So it fits together like a Lego set. And what you finally end up with is this. It's the great wheel of the goddess. Right? The Mahachakra, Devi Mahachakra. And that's not all. I'm going to magnify the top. Sorry for the blurry image. It's taken from a PDF. And you go down to the 3rd syllable in the most, and you start reading from there in turn, one by one. And then by the time that you describe an entire circle around the whole form, what you get is a hidden shloka. a hidden verse, in which the son of Nona, who's the poet, confesses that he has performed his worship of the goddess under this title, as instructed in a dream. And it's a worship. The extraordinary nature of his poem is because he has been instructed by her, right, on how to do it. And he has made this difficult stotra poem in loving worship of the goddess. Right? And now remember that the one that we saw with the 4 billion some forms has actually was number 84. So while he's doing that, he's also fitting it into this larger structure that he's building along the way. Now, what's interesting about this is, who is this interesting person who is the son of Nona? As it turns out, it is none other than our friend Ambiguity. Right? And who you'll remember now that instruction is being offered to modern poets and so on. For mature poets, honey alone is poetry. And we know from internal evidence in the poem that this is not an earlier career work that he did when he was 20. Right? He has references to earlier works in this. It's a nice kind of biographical puzzle for the scholars. Ingalls reads it as a kind of Freudian drama. Anand has this huge talent in this area, but he is so ashamed of writing this kind of tacky poetry that he's never able to bring himself to do it until the goddess appears to him in a dream, right? The suppressed always emerges again. And when the goddess appears to you in a dream and tells you to do something, if you have any sense, you jump to it. And so he writes this. Right? But I've spent a lot of time over the last 5 years looking at this image. And because I'm a fiction writer, I'm allowed to make up different stories, right? So the way that I would read it differently is that I think this is a work of a later mature man who's had some of his younger arrogance knocked out of it. A lot of pronouncements about what poetry is and what poetry cannot be and what is frustrating inside you. And I would also suggest that in this image, we see it's not simple. We see resonances, we see depth, right? So that for one thing, it is a worship of the goddess done in language. Right? And in the Indian tradition, when you say a mantra, when an adept says a mantra, it's not that the mantra summons the goddess, or you're speaking to the goddess. Properly uttered, the mantra is the goddess. The sounds of the syllables are the body of the goddess. She is here. Right? So in some sense, what we're looking at is the goddess herself. And these guys were all part, as far as we know, of a tantric tradition in which they also have this idea of the yantra, which is an abstract symbol that you use to meditate. Right? And so here what you have is a yantra that is made out of language itself. Right? Out of the language which is in itself a goddess. Right? And so we see then all the layerings and the ambiguities and the mysteries of language itself. All right. Thank you.